Well, hello. Glad to have you back for another one of our studies in the churches in Revelation. We're concluding our studies on Smyrna with this lesson. So follow along as I read, and we'll get right to our lesson. To the church, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Well, this is again the suffering church. We've talked about that, and we spent a good deal of time talking about that last week. But we want to look a little bit more on the nature of that suffering. We see that they were a poor church. Now, again, poverty back in these days was extreme poverty. It is not the kind of poverty where you're a little uncomfortable as you try to get to the next paycheck. It was a devastating kind of poverty where you don't know where the next meal is coming or the one after that. Even if you solve the problem of this meal, the next one's an issue. It is to be exposed to the elements. It is to be homeless or at the point of starvation. It was very, very serious. And this was well known in the ancient world. People depended upon their harvest. If the harvest failed, it was going to be a very, very difficult a few months ahead until they could plant again. And if it was a period of famine, it could be really devastating. If an invading army came through and looted and took all the crops that had been stored, it meant a long, prolonged period of starvation. So when Jesus talks about their poverty, he's talking about that type of poverty of not knowing where tomorrow's meal is going to come from, or if there'll be shelter, or if there'll be any hope at all. So they were suffering. Now, what is interesting about the Christians in this day is there was an unselfishness that even in suffering, the Christians were known to give away what they had. We know that during times of plague, that it was the Christians who went in and ministered to the dying, themselves becoming sick and dying. That is what was one of the things that won the Roman Empire over, was the the unselfishness of the Christians. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we know that degree of unselfishness? Would we give away the last that we had? Would we risk our own lives for people who despised us? Well, the Smyrnans did. There was slander. Now, slander is a very difficult thing because a lot of times we don't know who did it. It can be gossip. We can be the subject of gossip. And it's not a misunderstanding. Sometimes, people misunderstand what we say, and we find out that okay, yeah, they didn't know what I was doing or didn't know all the facts. But slander is purposely trying to smear the reputation of another person. It actually is akin to the Greek word for blaspheme. So when someone is slandering, they're actually blaspheming, like they would blaspheme God, the reputation of another person. And there were lots of reasons why that happened in the early church. The early church was misunderstood. For example, when they had communion, there were people who thought, well, they were actually eating real flesh and drinking real blood, so they thought they were cannibals. Very strange. When they heard about the love feast, which was the fellowship meal, because people had dirty minds, they accused the Christians of having orgies and being immoral. And this was actually based in fact, and that is that they split up families, and that did happen because some chose to follow Christ and some did not, and that split up families, and so they were hated for that reason. They were accused of atheism because they didn't worship the idols. They worshiped an invisible God, and to people who had always had idols, it seemed like that was atheism. They are accused of being disloyal because they would not bow the knee and pay homage to the statue of Caesar and say that Caesar is Lord. And so they were considered to be unpatriotic. They were considered to be very pessimistic people because they preached about the end of the world and the doom and gloom kind of thing. A lot of it probably originated in the Jewish community, and that's why these are called the Jews in the synagogue of Satan. That's a very strong term that Jesus is using to speak about this synagogue. Now, no doubt there were other synagogues that were not in favor of the Christians, but this one apparently was a real center place for doing everything they could to destroy the Christians. And so they slandered the Christians so that people would distinguish between the Jews and the Christians, because at first they did not. And so it was a very hurtful thing. And, if you've ever been slandered, you say, that's not true. I've been slandered before. And when I heard what was said, I said, that's not true. That's not true. And I realized it was hard to change minds because people got it in their heads and they thought it was true. And the only thing I could do is live my life in such a way as to prove it was not true. And that takes time. And we want it solved right away. Well, that's where they were. Jesus told them that they were, after all that they were going through, they now were going to suffer imprisonment. And he says that the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Now, I can tell you right now, Bible scholars don't know what that reference to 10 days is. They don't know what it means. Maybe at the time it made a lot of sense to the Smyrna church, but right now it's the meaning's kind of been lost to us. So don't get lost on that. That's a small thing. It's a minor point. Don't get lost on it. The point is that they were going to suffer imprisonment. And Christians, of course, even today are suffering imprisonment. And we've talked before about the Roman prisons and how horrible they were. They were basically, you're sent there to die, either to wait for an execution was a main purpose, or just stay there until the disease. Of course, there's tuberculosis. There was the plague. There was all sorts of other communicable diseases there. There was filth. There was poor food. There really wasn't anything. Poor lighting. It was terrible lighting. And it was the smells. You can imagine the smells that were in that place. It was suffocating. And so the idea of being in prison wasn't something, I'll stay in jail overnight and be fine. It was a very frightening kind of prospect for these Christians here in Smyrna. So we look at that and we see this was what was ahead. But Jesus said to them that they would be given a crown of life. Now, that's a wonderful thing. Now, remember, we talked about in our first lesson on Smyrna that Mount Pagos had at the top of it a ring of temples, so that the top of Mount Pagos looked like it had a crown on top. And that was kind of one of the things that Smyrna was known for. And it showed, and what Jesus was saying is, the city prides itself in having a crown on Mount Pagos. But you who are my children, you will have a crown. You will be recognized. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. He calls the church here to be faithful. Now, this city, as we talked about in our first lesson, had allied itself with Rome very early on in its history. And it had remained a faithful ally of Rome. Rome knew it could count on the people of Smyrna. It may not be able to count on anybody else in Asia, but the people in Smyrna were going to stand with them. They would fight with them. They would send things to their troops when they were fighting. They were going to be there. That's to be a citizen of Smyrna meant that you knew what it was to be faithful and stand true. And Jesus is saying that to the Christians. Just like as a citizen of Smyrna, you have stood true to the nation of Rome. Stand true and be faithful to the Christ who you name. Be faithful, be with him, even in this terrible environment where you live, even in the storm that you're in. Be faithful. And my dear friends, Christ is calling you to that. And again, the promise of it is that you'll get this crown of life, that you will be rewarded. Now, it's a beautiful thing to think about. I've wondered a little bit, what is that crown of life going to look like? And I don't have any answers. The Bible isn't very, very specific about it. So I guess in a way we can allow ourselves to think about it and maybe come up with our own ideas, knowing that the Lord's probably going to show us something we don't expect at all. But what if it's made up of, just like these people of Smyrna, their sacrifices, what they've given for Christ, what they've given in service, that each one of those types of things becomes another facet of the crown. And that at the end of the day, of their days, when they meet the Lord and he greets them and welcomes them home, that crown is handcrafted by the Lord himself. And it represents the kind of life we've lived. Now, for some, that's going to be a pretty sparse crown because they really haven't lived for the Lord. But some have lived a rich life for the Lord. And in this moment, in this very moment, are sacrificing or ready to sacrifice as God may direct. That attitude of heart counts as much as the gift itself. And so the Lord will say, I've made this to represent the life you've lived, and I put it on your head. Now, the glory of it is we get to cast it at his feet, because if we truly did what we did for his glory and for his sake, then we'll be almost embarrassed to have the crown on our heads. We'll say, it was for you. It was always meant for you. It was not meant for me. And I have no choice but to give it back to you. Now, I don't know if that's true, but perhaps it's an idea of that. Whatever it is, it was something that encouraged the people in Smyrna and made them realize that what they were doing and what they were giving was not for nothing, but for something. And that the Lord himself was taking note. And so where you are living now, what you're doing now, the Lord is taking note. He sees what you're doing. And sometimes that's scary because we're doing the wrong thing. But he sees us when we do the right thing. If no one else sees it, no one else notices, no one else cares, he knows. And he knows about you. Now that's a great promise. And that alone is like a crown of life. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this study about Smyrna. We'll move on to the next church next week. God bless you.